All right, I think we'll get started. It looks like folks have joined. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our third annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in Environmental Data Science speaker series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Sara Cannon, who's our second speaker in this seminar series. I'm Ben Halpern. I'm the director of NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And at NCEAS, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as to transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. So for more information, check out the NCEAS website. Before we begin, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCEAS is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of Indigenous peoples. As we come together to bring awareness to issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science, we strive to prioritize Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. And now I'll hand it off to Alessandra Vidal-Mesa to introduce you to our speaker for today and give you some logistical information about this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Halpern, for that introduction. I'm Alessandra Vidal-Mesa, and I'm a student in the Master of Environmental Data Science program at the Brent School of Environmental Science and Management in partnership with the NCEAS. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sara Cannon to our DIJ seminar series. And for all you joining for the webinar, please add any questions that you may have during the talk through the Q&A button, which you may find at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to write these as the talk goes on and write your questions you have throughout the presentation. And we will get to them at the end for a moderated Q&A. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Sara Cannon. Sara Cannon is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Indigenous Fisheries from the Institute of the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. She's a third-generation settler of Irish and Croatian descent who grew up on the traditional Piscataway territory along the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, USA. Before moving to Canada to pursue her graduate studies, Sara earned her Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She received her Master of Science and PhD from the University of British Columbia's Department of Geography. There, she studied the cumulative and interactive effects of climate change and local human-related threats to coral reefs in the Gilbert Islands of Kiribati and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, both atoll nations in the Central Pacific. Sara is passionate about producing actionable research that is directed by and centers the needs and voices of Indigenous peoples. In her role, Sara partners with the Chilcotin First Nation to support the Fisheries Department's ongoing stewardship of Fraser River sockeye and Chinook salmon. Sara will speak today about unsettling ecology and shifting power from university-affiliated researchers to Indigenous peoples. Dr. Cannon, we're excited to have you. And please take it away knowing that we're super excited and welcome to learn from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And huge thank you to you, Alessandra and NCEAS, for that introduction and for having me here. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that if you're joining us from North America today, you were calling in from Indigenous land that was either stolen outright or ceded through treaties that were often signed under circumstances that made Indigenous consent impossible. And if you're not sure whose lands you're on, I encourage you to visit this website, nativeland.ca, for more information and to learn more about the nations who take care of the lands on which we reside and work. And so I'm calling today from what is now known as Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo nations. This first red arrow here is where I live and where I'm calling in from now. And this red arrow on the left here is where the Vancouver campus of the University of British Columbia is located. And that's also where the Center for Indigenous Fisheries is based. And then, although we're meeting via Zoom today, I also wanted to just take a quick moment to acknowledge the Chumash peoples, who are the caretakers of what we now call Santa Barbara, where NCEAS is located. So I wanted to give a really quick overview of where this talk is going. I plan to start by setting the stage. And so here I will talk about my approach to this discussion, my positionality, why I'm the one who's talking about this today, and I'll define some of the terminology that I'm using. Then I'll move on to demonstrate how academia is still complicit in settler colonialism, and I'll use some examples to talk about this. Next, I plan to discuss how non-Indigenous researchers are responsible for dismantling colonialism. And I'll share some of the ways that I've attempted to make myself accountable to Indigenous scholars and communities as a settler and aspiring ally. And then I'll wrap up with some final thoughts. So again, first, I'm planning to start by setting the stage with some background information. And to begin, I wanted to clarify why I'm speaking about Indigenous peoples specifically today and not other marginalized groups who also face discrimination and oppression in academia and more broadly in society today. So ecologists have a tendency to refer to Indigenous people as stakeholders, but Indigenous folks are distinct from other stakeholders and other marginalized groups of people because they're members of sovereign nations that have internationally recognized rights that stakeholders don't have. And these rights have been described in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And as a settler, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, I can't and shouldn't speak for Indigenous folks. So throughout this presentation, you'll see that I've turned to Indigenous voices for guidance wherever possible. And I'm also going to provide citations. And at the very end, I give you a QR code so where you can download the bibliography for more information. Also throughout the talk, I've attempted to follow Dr. Max Liboiron's practice of marking relations to land wherever possible by noting how the people I've referenced identify themselves, as I've done here for Dr. Liboiron, who is Michif and settler descent. So I'm here today to talk with you about my experiences working alongside Indigenous partners and what I've learned about my responsibilities to Indigenous peoples as a settler who works and lives on stolen Indigenous territories. And to do that, it's important to make my positionality visible, to clearly describe how I'm related to the lands and waters on which I live and work. And that's because my positionality as a queer white settler woman undoubtedly frames the ways that I see the world and the questions that I ask in the research that I do. So for example, my background means that I probably hold implicit biases that I cannot address without thinking about where I come from and how I came to be where I am today. So considering my positionality is also an opportunity for thinking about my responsibilities as a scientist and particularly as a white settler. Because as a settler, I materially benefit from settler colonialism at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And that means I'm responsible for doing the work to address the harms that I continue to benefit from today. So Alessandra already shared some of this in her wonderful introduction, but I'm a third generation settler. My mom's family is from Croatia. My dad's family is from Ireland. I grew up on the Patuxent River and the Chesapeake Bay in Southern Maryland on Piscataway territory. I left home at 16 because of some unhealthy family dynamics, and I didn't finish high school, but I did go back and got my graduate equivalence degree before starting my academic career. I'm a single mom to a 19-year-old son, Daniel, who's in the middle of this photo here. And that's me on the left and my mom on the right at my mom's home on the Patuxent River. Before I started my academic career, I spent 3 years working in drug policy in Washington, D.C. And that experience gave me awareness and a language about social justice issues that a lot of people who are trained in ecology don't have. And then in 2010, I moved to California to start my undergraduate degree in marine biology at UC Santa Cruz, which I completed in 2014. And then after that, I moved to Vancouver in 2015 to start graduate school at the University of British Columbia's Department of Geography, where I received my master's in 2017 and my PhD in 2022. And I started my current postdoc with the Center for Indigenous Fisheries in January of this year. So again, these experiences have undoubtedly shaped the way I approach my research and the questions that I have. And by sharing them with you, I'm hoping that I can start being accountable for those approaches. So my graduate research took place in the Central Pacific Islands, where I investigated interactions between local and global stressors that affect coral reefs in the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands of Kiribati. And for one of my research chapters, I also analyzed how coral reef conservationists talk about the threats that are facing coral reefs today. And I identified distinct narratives with racist and colonial roots. And I'm working on prepping this chapter for publication. And I hope that it will be helpful for challenging racism and colonialism in conservation science by bringing these narratives to light and by pointing to their origins. For my PhD research, I worked closely with marine managers and knowledge holders in Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. And I've also had the pleasure and honor of being involved in some additional projects that have been given me the opportunity to work alongside Indigenous partners before I joined the Center for Indigenous Fisheries. So for example, I was part of a team at Simon Fraser University that put together an Indigenous data sovereignty workshop for First Nations knowledge holders and technical staff. And this provided a space for discussion about Indigenous data sovereignty and salmon stewardship in British Columbia. So we've prepped a manuscript from this workshop that summarizes steps for First Nations as they are reasserting sovereignty over their data and makes recommendations for non-Indigenous researchers who work on Indigenous territories to incorporate Indigenous data sovereignty into the design of their research. I've also been incredibly fortunate to support a really wonderful course that's hosted at UBC and the Haida Gwaii Institute called Co-Creating Aquatic Science. This course was co-designed over the last 2 years with a team of folks from UBC and the Haida Gwaii Institute, and it just took place for the first time online in the spring. It aims to teach the fundamentals of co-creating aquatic science alongside Indigenous partners. And this photo in the middle here is from our inaugural capstone gathering in Haida Gwaii that took place this last April. Finally, since 2019, I've curated a reading list about decolonizing conservation that is geared towards non-Indigenous audiences. And I hope this list will be a tool that non-Indigenous folks can use to educate ourselves about the colonial roots of biodiversity conservation and to start thinking about how we can avoid perpetuating those same harms today. And so you might be wondering why you're hearing about this from me and not directly from an Indigenous scholar. And I don't presume to speak for Indigenous folks in any way, which is why I've tried to quote Indigenous scholars wherever I can, like this quote from Dr. David Chavez, his tweet I'm showing here. From my experience working in the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, while it's important to hear directly from Indigenous leaders and to create opportunities to learn directly from Indigenous scholars, at the same time, Indigenous academics are being overburdened by the need to address systemic harms within academia. So at some point, non-Indigenous folks need to take on that labor of decolonization instead of asking Indigenous folks to continue to explain it. And so I'm hoping that by doing I'll be doing at least a small part of this labor by giving this talk today. That said, one thing I've grappled with a lot since joining the Center for Indigenous Fisheries is the ways that even by taking on extra work, like giving this talk, I'm benefiting from being a settler that works in a majority Indigenous space. And I don't have the same demands on my time that Indigenous folks who are working on the Center for Indigenous Fisheries team have, for example, which means that I can take on opportunities like the chance to give this talk today. And while those opportunities might be additional work, it still benefits me because I've received exposure from being here today, and I'm able to meet with some wonderful folks like Alessandra and Ben and everyone at NCEAS. And this is yet another reason why I'm trying to quote Indigenous voices throughout this talk, because the exposure and acknowledgement really should be going to the Indigenous peoples who've been calling for decolonization for decades and centuries. And given how I've benefited from settler colonialism as a settler and continue to benefit as a settler that works in a majority Indigenous space, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to profit from doing this labor. So I'm attempting to be accountable to all of you here today by sharing publicly that I'm donating the honorarium from NCEAS to the Unistoten Camp. And Unistoten Camp is an Indigenous-led reoccupation of Wet'suwet'en territory in central British Columbia that's meant to enforce the hereditary leader's decision to preserve the territory for future generations. So to this end, a cabin was built in the exact place where the Trans-Canada, Enbridge, and Pacific Trails went to lay pipelines, and the cabin continues to be occupied by Unistoten Camp today. So I've mentioned colonialism, settler colonialism, and settlers several times so far, but I want to make sure that I'm being crystal clear about what I mean when I use those terms. So colonialism is a policy or practice of a nation state acquiring control, full or partial political control over another nation state and exploiting it for its economic purposes. So colonialism depends on Indigenous labor and surplus goods that benefit the colonial state. Settler colonialism is a specific kind of colonialism in which settlers from the colonial nation state seek to displace and replace Indigenous peoples so that settlers are able to create a new colony in the image and the name of the original nation state. So this is what occurred and continues to occur in Canada and the United States. Importantly, as Chelsea Val says here, and as several scholars have argued, settler colonialism and colonialism are both ongoing structures, not singular events, which means that, as Chelsea Val says, it doesn't matter if we're here at the beginning of the event because we still continue to live in a structure that was built by colonialism and white supremacy, which means that we all have an obligation to dismantle it. And this is especially true of settlers who benefit the most from this structure. And when I refer to settlers, I'm specifically speaking about non-Indigenous folks in Canada and the United States who are from the European descended social political majority. And as Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang have argued, settlers are not the same as immigrants because immigrants are beholden to the laws of the lands in which they migrate to, whereas settlers remake the laws of the lands in image of a homeland. Settlers are also not the descendants of Africans who were kidnapped or sold into chattel slavery during the transatlantic slave trade. In Canada today, there's been a movement for reconciliation, and that a lot of that comes from, or is the result of the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which summarizes findings from 6 years of hearings and testimony from over 6,500 witnesses who are affected by Canada's policy of removing Indigenous children from their homes and forcing them to attend residential schools. The report issued 94 calls to action for reconciliation, many of which are leading to indigenization and decolonization efforts in Canadian universities today. At the same time, in both the United States and Canada, non-Indigenous scientists are increasingly recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is vital for solving threats to biodiversity and threats from climate change that are occurring today. And so this has led to a push to include Indigenous knowledge in research and for more partnerships to co-produce knowledge, alongside government mandates to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into policy. But this can put burdens on Indigenous knowledge holders, and without careful attention, it can perpetuate harmful extractive research practices that have been so common through today. And while this increasing recognition of Indigenous knowledge might lead to opportunities, it can also require special attention to ensure that Indigenous folks are the ones who are leading the charge about how Indigenous knowledge can be used and incorporated into policy to affect the threats to the environment today. So again, I've mentioned decolonization and indigenization, but I want to be careful to define specifically what I'm talking about when I use those terms. And decolonization is the work of critically examining, and I would argue dismantling, Western Eurocentric hierarchies of colonization and oppression, which includes white supremacy and the patriarchy. And Tuck and Yang have argued that decolonization requires Indigenous self-determination and the return of stolen lands. Indigenization, by contrast, is engaging Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing as being just as valuable and a parallel means of constructing knowledge and practices to Western science. As Yvonne Poitras-Pratt and Kita Gladue point out here, decolonization is a precursor to the work of indigenization, and it can lead to unsettling the academy to make space for ethical engagement and resituating ourselves within the structure of academia. So now I'd like to switch gears a bit and give some examples of how academia is continuing to perpetuate settler colonialism. Before I move on, I just also would like to remind folks to please leave questions in the Q&A form, and then we'll get to them at the end of the talk. So for those of us who are not Indigenous, and in particular those of us who are settlers, we benefit from settler colonialism today. And not only is academia literally built on stolen Indigenous land and using stolen labor, but Indigenous lands have funded and continue to fund much of the US academic system. In addition, Western ways of knowing continue to marginalize Indigenous peoples and peoples of color around the world. An example of this marginalization of knowledge is cognitive imperialism. And this is what Dr. Marie Batiste defines as a form of cognitive manipulation used to disclaim other knowledge bases and values. So in the words of Dr. Batiste, the gift of modern knowledge has been the ideology of oppression, which negates the process of knowledge as a process of inquiry to explore new solutions. This ideology seeks to change the consciousness of the oppressed, not change the situation that oppressed them. I learned about land-grant universities thanks to a fantastic investigation by High Country News, and I encourage you to visit landgrabu.org, this website here, to check out the interactive maps that they've created. So the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, and it was signed by President Lincoln to distribute what the act called public domain lands to US states to fund academic institutions. As a result of the act, over 11 million acres were seized from at least 250 tribes and communities. And the Morrill Act required that these land sales be used in perpetuity, so the funds remain on the ledger of 52 modern land-grant universities today. So in 2020, High Country News released the results of their 2-year investigation, in which they tracked down 99% of all Morrill Act acres and researched the that was raised from the sale of those lands in the 19th and 20th centuries. The US paid less than $400,000 total for this land and nothing for about 25% of the lands that were seized, while the grants of land that raised endowment principal for 52 institutions in the United States. As of 2022, at least 12 states still own the same lands that were stolen through the Morrill Act, and this includes the mineral rights to those lands. The lands continue to produce revenue for academic institutions today. Academia also continues to displace Indigenous folks for the sake of science and research today, which is a clear continuation of settler colonialism. So for example, the mountain Mauna Kea is on the big island of Hawaii is sacred to Native Hawaiian peoples who have always opposed any development on the mountain. For astronomists, however, Mauna Kea is a near ideal location because of its dark skies from the lack of light pollution, low humidity, high elevation, et cetera, and because it's located in a low latitude location. Over the years, the opposition to the observatories has been the most visible example of the conflict Western science has encountered over access and use of environmental and culturally significant Indigenous sites. In 2019, Native Hawaiians blocked entrance to Mauna Kea for 2 weeks, and almost 40 protesters were arrested, most of them Native Hawaiian elders. The opposition against the newest and largest telescope on the mountain, the 30-meter telescope, continues today, and to date, construction has not yet begun. So now I'm going to move on to talking a bit about the responsibilities that those of us who are non-Indigenous hold to dismantle settler colonialism. And this is especially true, again, for those of us who are settlers. As I've said before, non-Indigenous scholars, settlers in particular, as settlers are the people who benefit the most from settler colonialism, have a responsibility to take on the labor for dismantling colonialism. So for example, here, Dr. Kyle Powys-White says that decolonizing will take creativity from Indigenous peoples who have already creatively survived oppressive capitalist, industrial, and colonial domination. But Dr. White points out that decolonization will above all require that allies take responsibility and confront the assumptions behind actions and aspirations. I also want to point out, though, that Indigenous peoples have different responsibilities from non-Indigenous peoples. So as Dr. Winona Wheeler describes here, and as I spoke about with my friend who is part of NCEAS last week, Phoebe Racine, who many of you probably know, Indigenous scholars are also accountable to their communities as well as to the university system. And these standards can be, and often are, at odds with each other. So as Dr. Wheeler points out, Indigenous scholars are just as, if not more, accountable to their own communities as to the academic community, because it is Indigenous communities where the practical work is needed and where the benefits may be the greatest. As a white settler academic, these are just some of the ways that I've tried to meet my responsibilities and to hold myself accountable for doing the work to decolonize academia. And I will briefly go through each one of these. But before I do, I just want to clarify that I'm not sharing these here as an example of what I think that other people should do, but because by being here today and by giving this talk, I consider myself accountable to everyone watching and listening now and in the future. And the best way I can think of to practice that accountability is to make the ways that I'm thinking about decolonization known and to be open for feedback and discussion. So specifically, I've tried to listen to and follow Indigenous leadership. And this is true in both the projects I've been a part of, in which I recognize that Indigenous folks are the authorities when it comes to Indigenous issues, and also in terms of my scholarship more broadly, such as within my academic department and within the university. And listening and following Indigenous leadership doesn't necessarily mean that we should be waiting to talk to an Indigenous person directly and getting instructions directly from them about what we can do to support decolonization. Because there are decades of publications, talks, and resources calling for settlers and non-Indigenous folks to take on some of the labor that's necessary for dismantling colonialism. And we can turn to those resources for guidance. And that brings me to my next point. Educating myself has been a really, really important part of starting to think about what it means to be accountable to Indigenous nations on whose lands and waters I've lived and worked. Indigenous scholars have been writing about work that needs to happen to indigenize, decolonize, and unsettle academia for decades. And it's our responsibility, those of us who are non-Indigenous or settler researchers, to educate ourselves, which means that ignorance is not an excuse for inaction. In fact, as Dr. Kuwakanen says here, responsibility demands action and necessitates knowledge. So not only do we need to know how to act, but we also need to know how to act in a manner that is responsible. And so this is why I've started the Decolonizing Conservation reading list, to start educating myself. And I've also shared it publicly because I hope that others who are not Indigenous will find it helpful for starting to do the same. And educating ourselves can also reduce burdens on Indigenous peoples who are often asked and expected to explain things to settlers and other non-Indigenous folks. As Casey Sterling, a member of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, says here, everyone shares a responsibility to understand and learn about Indigenous histories and realities. And doing this must be done in ways that can minimize the additional burden and emotional labor on the part of Indigenous peoples. So accountability and responsibility means different things in practice to different nations, depending on the context in which partnerships are occurring. And that's where the relational accountability comes in. Dr. Nicholas J. Rio says that relational accountability implies that researchers are responsible for nurturing relationships with community collaborators and are accountable to the entirety of the community in which we're working. And that can include more than human relations. Also, this is not limited to research partnerships. Relational accountability can also apply to partnerships that occur within academic departments or universities, for example, such as indigenization initiatives. I also attempt to take on some of the busy work that is occurring behind the scenes to help balance the differences in demands on Indigenous people's time. So this has required looking for opportunities to take on labor or stepping up and volunteering when finding those opportunities. Taking on some of that labor can allow Indigenous scholars to spend time on their own research interests, responsibilities to their communities, and supporting other Indigenous academics and students within academia. So practicing humility may be one of the most challenging things I aspire to do as part of my responsibilities as a settler scholar working with Indigenous partners. Humility doesn't come easily to Western trained academics because we're so often encouraged to self-promote in academia. And for me, humility means reflecting critically on the assumptions that I hold, which I may or may not always be aware of. And sometimes I'm not aware of them until I've been called out or called in by the people that I work with. Humility also means stepping back when I have felt defensive and taking steps to not be impulsive when I am called out or called in on some of the things that I've managed to do incorrectly. So I have the impulsive form of ADHD, which means that not being impulsive can be really hard for me, but misunderstandings do happen. And it's been really important for me to realize that most of the time, these misunderstandings are more the result of the colonial systems in which we work. And they're less about me personally. So this comes down to the importance of letting go of ego. My wonderful advisor, Dr. Andrea Reed, who's a member of the Niska Nation, and my colleagues at the Center for Indigenous Fisheries have corrected me a number of times. So for example, I pronounced names incorrectly or may have made incorrect assumptions. And it's been really important for me to recognize that this takes time and effort on the part of colleagues that I work with. So taking the time to correct me is not something that they will do for everyone. And the fact that they do take the time to educate me when I make a mistake is a gift and something that I've been really grateful for, because it demonstrates that they trust me to learn from those mistakes and to do better going forward. And this in turn continues to motivate me to do better and to reduce the amount of mistakes that I'm making in the future. One additional way that I try to meet my responsibilities to unsettle academia is by not giving up on those responsibilities. And doing the work to decolonize and unsettle academia is pretty challenging. It can be really frustrating in academia, in particular when talking with people who are only beginning to recognize the ways that settler colonialism, that academia is complicit in settler colonialism today. But settler scholars and non-Indigenous academics shouldn't take time out, and we can't take a time out, because sitting on the sidelines is essentially the same thing as supporting ongoing colonialism. It is a choice that we make to sit on the sideline if we choose to sit on the sidelines. And one thing that I try to remember is that I may get to close my computer at the end of the day and stop thinking about settler colonialism, but it's not something that Indigenous scholars and Indigenous partners can do. They don't have a choice. to take a break from settler colonialism, or to ignore it and to not think about it. And so thinking about this motivates me to keep going and to make a sustained choice every day to practice my research and scholarship through a lens of decolonization and with the goal of unsettling academia. So I recognize that this talk has gone pretty quickly, but I hope that that actually means that we'll have more time to discuss and time for questions, which I'm very much looking forward to. Again, if you haven't already, if you do have questions, please leave them in the question and answer session, or the question and answer button at the bottom or top of your screen on Zoom. So I've shared these approaches that I've taken, again, not to hold myself up as an example of what others should do, because I've made plenty of mistakes and I know that I'll continue to make mistakes, although I strive to minimize them so that I can minimize the amount of harm and the amount of extra work I'm causing for Indigenous colleagues that I work alongside. But I also wanted to use this time to share how I thought about decolonization, because by being a part of the seminar series, again, I hope to make myself accountable to all of you as colleagues. I invite you to share any feedback and suggestions that you have via my contact info, which will be on the last page. And I will also provide an anonymous feedback form with the QR code that contains the bibliography of all the folks that I've cited today. The approaches that I've shared here have all been shaped by my experiences working with Indigenous colleagues, partners, and friends over the last decade, as well as what I've learned from the Indigenous scholars whose work I've turned to for guidance. But the practices that other settlers and non-Indigenous scholars use will be different depending on the Indigenous nations who care for the lands and waters on which you live and work, your specific research, the institutions where you're hosted, and your positionality. And so what I've shown are just examples of a few of the infinite ways that non-Indigenous researchers can start meeting our many responsibilities, but these ways don't end here. This is a really, really big topic, but I hope that I've at least set the stage for future conversations among non-Indigenous academics that desperately need to happen. And decolonization has to happen. First and foremost, it's an ethical imperative because universities depend upon and perpetuate ongoing colonialism today to operate. In addition, decolonizing academia may also be a key part in the strategy for addressing climate change and threats to biodiversity that occur today. So I'm going to end here. And again, I recognize that it is a bit shorter than we were expecting, but I'm hoping that we can use that time for discussion. I've also put the bibliography for this talk on a Google document that you can access here via this QR code. And I wanted to very super quickly acknowledge the many Indigenous folks who have offered me guidance and who have showed me incredible support and patience throughout my academic career to date. So please do feel free to contact me by email after the talk. There's also an anonymous feedback link on the Google Doc that is at this QR code here if you'd like to get in touch or provide feedback anonymously. And thank you so much again for listening, and to NCEAS for having me today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cannon, for your talk and for sharing. We really enjoyed and have appreciated hearing about your experiences and your reflections. We do have some questions from the audience, and we'd like to start with those.
Excellent.
First of all.
Thank you.
Oh, hello. So our first question comes from, do you have advice for steps to start a land back movement for those of us at land-grant universities?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I kind of shied away from giving very specific or concrete steps here, because I know that, because as a non-Indigenous person, I want to defer to Indigenous folks who are leading those movements. There are a number of resources that you can turn to for how to support or start land back movements at land-grant universities. I would probably recommend starting with the High Country News article and then going from there and reading a bit more about some of those movements that are already existing on different campuses, because there may actually be one on the campus which you're located. Being in Canada, it's a little bit of a different situation, so I'm not 100% familiar with some of those movements, but again, they already exist, and a lot of these movements have been around for decades, and so I've been kind of trying to point people towards learning from Indigenous scholars who've been doing that work rather than trying to provide steps or recommendations myself. I know that might not be the most satisfying answer, but I do feel that I'm not 100% the most qualified person to tell people what to do specifically, other than to turn to Indigenous leaders.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful answer.
Thank you.
Definitely something I've heard echoed in a recent podcast, actually, by the Land Back Indian Collective. here in the US. So
Awesome.
yeah.
I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
So we'd like to, another question we've gotten and like to share is, can you give more specific examples of daily or weekly actions you or others in academics can take to decolonize university or institution research?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And so most of the actions that I have listed here are things that I try to do daily. So every day it is a conscious choice to make sure to ask myself repeatedly what it is that I'm doing to support those efforts. And so one thing that some scholars have started doing is co-producing knowledge alongside Indigenous partners. That's something that the Center for Indigenous Fisheries does specifically. Everyone who works in the Center for Indigenous Fisheries works with Indigenous partners to address questions that are of interest to the nations themselves or our partners, the people that we're working with. You may notice also that I corrected myself when using language like our or my partners, because I don't want to refer to Indigenous partners using terms of ownership, given the history of colonialism. So it's common to say things like, my research partners or my colleagues, but I'm trying to move away from that. So I've been trying to catch myself as I say those things. But just that's another example, I guess, is just being aware of the language that we use and how that language can perpetuate colonialism. But again, I think that, and I don't mean for this to sound like a cop-out in any way, I just really don't want to speak for anyone who's Indigenous. And I think that it depends on you specifically, where you're located and what your positionality is. But the most important thing I think that all of us can and need to do is turn to Indigenous leadership and find out what's being done and has been done by them already, and where they would like support from aspiring allies. Because as a non-Indigenous person, it's really not up to me to tell people what the most effective ways for us to support decolonization initiatives are.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to actually pose a question of our own from the organizers.
Thank you.
You mentioned co-production as part of your work for Center for Indigenous Fisheries, and one of the questions we had was, well, just even with knowing the plurality of Indigenous cultures, protocols, and different frameworks of knowledge, and the plurality of indigeneity, speaking mostly from your experience as a settler ecologist and your work, how does the process of knowledge co-production differ from the colonial frameworks of knowledge production that you've been a part of? And what are like the key differences?
It's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking. I should also, just before I answer that, note that I would love to hear if anyone else has resources or suggestions. I know that people aren't able to actually turn on their cameras and speak, but if you could drop them in the Q&A or anything like that, it would be great to also hear your thoughts, people's thoughts who are here today about the answers to some of these questions, because I know all of our experiences will be different. From my experience in co-producing knowledge, it's along with Indigenous partners, it's very different from the Western way of doing science. And a big part of that is because instead of coming in somewhere, sorry, let me back up for a second. From my experience as a PhD and a master's student in the geography department, working on coral reefs in the Central Pacific Islands, I did work with community partners, but those partnerships had existed before I joined the graduate department. My advisor had worked in Kiribati for over a decade, for example. And so I was kind of building off of some of those existing relationships and wasn't involved in the very beginning in co-producing those research frameworks. But as I've joined the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, the project that I'm working on with the Tsilhqot'in Nation Fisheries Department, it's being co-produced from the very beginning. And so I'd only just started my fellowship, my postdoctoral fellowship with the Center for Indigenous Fisheries this January, but we've actually been working on co-producing this research for the last couple of years as I've applied for postdoc funding, which has given us an opportunity to start building relationships and thinking about the research that's important to the Tsilhqot'in Nation themselves. So that 2 years of lead work is time consuming, but extremely, extremely important, because it's kind of gotten us to this place where we're able to build a research project that will be actionable for the Tsilhqot'in Nation, and that is being led by their priorities. And even despite that 2 years of work, we're only just now actually getting to the point where we've identified the the specific outcomes of the project and are kind of starting to collect the data and so forth. So that alone, that lead up time and the time it takes to build those relationships is probably one of the biggest differences, I think. And then also it takes a lot of kind of back and forth. So we've been going back and forth on like, well, here's what I think we could do to meet some of the questions that people have and so forth. So it's a very iterative process that involves just kind of constantly revisiting, and that I think will occur, again, we're in early stages, but I think that iterative part will occur throughout the project. So we have to be really open to making changes and making sure that if things will change throughout the course of the project. And so we have to be responsive to that.
Thank you. I think that's like a wonderful and very necessary look at things from Indigenous work and labor going on, research that is community-led, understanding that the process, while it's never linear, it really isn't linear when it is community accountable.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you.
Relations.
Thank you for summarizing that much more succinctly than I did.
Thank you for sharing. We have actually another question coming from the lounge upstairs where people are watching this live. And it is about your paper you mentioned about Indigenous data sovereignty.
Yes.
The question is, can you give a brief overview of the key takeaways from the data sovereignty paper you published?
Yes, it has not been published yet. We basically have a draft that is about ready for publication, and we're just waiting on a few more people to review it, and then we will submit it to a journal for peer review. But we're hoping to do that within the next couple of weeks. So it's really, really close to being ready to submit. And so that was, again, out of a workshop that was specifically for First Nations knowledge holders and technical staff based in British Columbia. And so it was very specific to that context. But I do think that a lot of what we discussed will be things that can be applicable to folks in North America more broadly. But essentially, the key point of this workshop is that Indigenous folks have rights to control, access, ownership, possession of Indigenous data. And that includes any data that is collected on Indigenous lands and territories by Indigenous peoples or by non-Indigenous researchers. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is that principle of how Indigenous folks have the right to control those data. And so this workshop brought together folks from all over British Columbia to discuss this and what it means for stewarding salmon in Indigenous territories as Indigenous nations are reasserting sovereignty in British Columbia today. And I think one of the key takeaways is that there is a lot of work that needs to be happening. But again, this work has been happening over the course of decades. But there's a lot of pressures that are happening in the context of things like the open data movement and this increasing recognition of Indigenous knowledge as being valuable, and these mandates to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into government policy and things like that. And all of those things could be opportunities for recognizing and enacting Indigenous data sovereignty, but as of yet are tending to be overlooked, or Indigenous data sovereignty is tending to be overlooked in those movements. And so a lot of the discussions were really highlighting ways that Indigenous folks can assert sovereignty over their data and protect their data while also attempting to make it usable and available to people who need it. And there are some key steps and takeaways that were summarized in the paper, but I don't have it in front of me, and I just don't want to specifically speak to any of the very specific outcomes of that without deferring to the paper itself. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer. We look forward to reading that paper.
Thank
I know
you.
there's definitely a lot of conversation going around Indigenous data sovereignty, and it's always interesting to see a tangible example of how it's actually happening with community. So we have another question coming in from the webinar. I'd like to just read it out loud. I recently felt uncomfortable giving land acknowledgements, given that some higher profile acknowledgements have been considered performative. For example, I've heard the sentiment about Air Canada's land acknowledgement. Do you have guidance to avoid a performative land acknowledgement? And performative.
Yes, thank you. That's such a fantastic question. I have also heard pushback about land acknowledgements and have felt uncomfortable with it because I understand that they can be performative. And my understanding is that I haven't seen the Air Canada land acknowledgement, but I can imagine a lot of times people just say it as a formality without actually engaging with what it means. I tend to think that land acknowledgements are really valuable because when I first moved to British Columbia, I was not aware of anything related to Indigenous issues and settler colonialism in academia and conservation. And it was land acknowledgements that kind of made me start thinking about this, because it was the first time I'd ever heard a land acknowledgement was when I started my master's in 2015 at UBC. And I didn't know what it was all about. And so I ended up wanting to learn more. And so I think that it can be really valuable in that sense. But I understand and I hear the calls from Indigenous folks that we need to go well beyond just acknowledging that we're on Indigenous land, and to really start thinking about and critically engaging with what it means to be living on stolen land and what responsibilities that gives us. So there's a really great resource that someone shared on Twitter that has a whole bunch of readings about land acknowledgements, and I didn't put it on there yet, but after the talk, I'll actually put it on the resource list that I've created here with the bibliography at this QR code. At the very bottom of that resource list, I did put a couple of things for further reading if people are interested. So I can add that resource about land acknowledgements. And those are, I think it's a list of folks who have all written about it who are from Indigenous peoples. So you can hear directly from them about ways to make sure that they're not performative.
Thank you. Yeah, I think always just reminding that it is Indigenous protocol to acknowledge the land, and how that needs to be centered even when it's done by these bigger institutions and in other like more co-opted ways. Important. So thank
Exactly.
you for
Thank you.
highlighting those voices who've already spoken on that. We'd like another question we have from the webinar coming in. It's a little longer, so I'm going to read it out loud. As a POC student, as a POC studying Pacific coral reefs, I find that educating and doing the work surrounding decolonization and conservation in academia has been laborious, and that my white counterparts tend to take a laid-back stance or engage in performative activism. How can I continue to do the work and yet hold my white counterparts accountable respectfully?
That is such a good question, and I can empathize with you, and I'd love to continue to talk with you about this. If you'd like to send me an email, we could talk more after the talk. But I'm just very sorry that you have to deal with that, and that's part of the reason why I've started doing things like trying to create the Decolonizing Conservation reading list. But I've also found that sometimes it can be really frustrating. I've started some discussion groups and things of that nature. I've visited discussion groups and have found some people are really motivated and other folks just don't seem to think it's important. And that was part of my motivation for kind of giving this talk today, was trying to demonstrate how, in just a few very brief examples, how we still depend on settler colonialism and how we continue to perpetuate it just by being a part of academia, even if we are critical of that structure of settler colonialism. It's a tough question to answer, because I really don't know how to hold people accountable and how to change people's minds beyond this. But I think that if we can start changing some of the norms by practicing them ourselves, that might be one thing that can continue to take on, that can continue to grow from our efforts. So, for example, I've tried in some of my publications about coral reefs, I've written about how coral reef degradation is often driven by colonialism. So, for example, there's a tendency in coral reef studies, as you probably know, to talk about coral reefs as being degraded or polluted, but not really to talk about the circumstances that have caused that degradation or pollution to begin with. And in the Marshall Islands and Kiribati, the capital atolls are both heavily polluted, and extremely densely populated. And that dense population comes from colonialism, because the colonial powers had relocated people to one central atoll. And it also comes from things like, the US testing nuclear bombs in parts of the Marshall Islands that forced people to move to the capital atoll and things of that nature. So putting 100,000 people or 60,000 people on a small atoll is going to put pressure on the coral reefs. And that's never something that's actually discussed in a peer-reviewed publication about coral reef health. And so in one of those publications, it's in PLOS One, I talked about how settler colonialism had driven the actions that led to coral reef degradation today. And when it went through peer review, one of the reviewers told me that that wasn't science and it wasn't relevant and it shouldn't be in the paper. And so I did push back and I explained why I thought it needed to be there, because by leaving that out, if we don't say that, it implicitly implies that reef degradation is the fault of local people, or local people are not taking care of their reefs, without recognizing that there's context and reasoning for what actually drove that pressure that the reefs are facing today. And so when I explained that to the editor, they were extremely supportive and it remained in the paper. And I'm hoping that maybe other people will see that and it will start becoming more common practice to point to the root causes of things that are driving degradation of the environment. But that's just one example. And I know this has been a bit rambly, but I think this is a really important question that you've asked. I'm happy to talk about it more and to brainstorm with you if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd just like to point to the many links you've left to contact you. And yeah, if anybody, we do have a few more questions that we may run out of time. So yeah, just making the offer you made available a little, plugging in a little bit more.
And I'm really grateful for all these questions too. Again, I know the talk itself was a little bit short, so it's great to have this opportunity to discuss.
Yeah, no, it's great to have an opportunity to reflect all together. And
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for the space. I want to prioritize a few questions coming in from new people, first-time askers. Another question we have is, do you have recommendations for initiating meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities when tribal leaders have expressed reluctance or ignored prior outreach attempts?
Honestly, in that case, I would probably not push for partnerships. If someone is kind of expressing that they're not interested, they probably have good reasons for that. And there's a lot been written. I would highly recommend reading Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, who is Maori. I'll put that on the reference list as well. But that talks about a lot of the history of colonial research practices and the way that Indigenous knowledge has been taken in extractive methodologies and so forth. And I can't say that that's why these leaders have not been responsive when you've reached out to them, but it could be why. And so I think it's really important to just kind of respect where people are at. And maybe you could do something like just leave an invitation open and say that you are make sure that the reasons that for wanting to partner with this person or this group specifically are the right reasons, and that they're reasons that will benefit the nations and the community themselves. And then you can leave an open invitation that says that you're open to discussing at some point in the future, for example, if it's something that they might be interested in and that might benefit them. But really, I think it's about respecting those boundaries while also trying to build trust. And I think one way that you can build trust is by respecting people's boundaries and by recognizing them, even though it is hard sometimes. So here in Vancouver, I know we're running out of time, but I'll just super briefly mention, I don't work directly with the Musqueam Nation, which is the land on which the University of British Columbia is located. And part of that is because the number of people who are at UBC greatly outnumber the number of citizens in the Musqueam Nation. And so they are overwhelmed with requests to collaborate. And while that is a good thing that people want to collaborate with them, it's also impossible for them to actually manage to collaborate with every person who wants to, given the number of people who are located at UBC. And so co-producing knowledge with Indigenous partners is super, super, super important, but there has to be a balance there to make sure that it's not a net burden in the long run to the nations themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, I think highlighting the impact and the decision of tribal leaders and community members themselves is important, and understanding like research outreach and research design. So thank you for highlighting that. We have a few other questions, and like I said, we're likely going to run out of time, so I apologize. But another question we have coming in is, I work for an NGO that helps scientists and knowledge holders, many of them academics, communicate better with audiences outside of their knowledge circle. How can those outside of academia that work closely with academics be part of this work in unsettling ecology?
It's a fantastic question. I think that, pretty much just now I can't even remember what I recommended or what I said, but I think a lot of what I did say about humility and doing the heavy lifting and things of that nature, doing your homework, following Indigenous leadership. Those are all things that apply to academics specifically, and especially settler and non-Indigenous academics, but that can also apply to people outside of academia. So it might be worth, I don't know, I'm sure there are organizations who specialize in communications with Indigenous nations or with Indigenous partners. And I'm sure there are Indigenous peoples who do that work as well. So I would probably start by looking for some of those organizations or people who are doing that work, and maybe reading some of the publications or resources that they've created. And then seeing how you could bring that together with academics, and maybe even just educating academics more about some of those things when you're working with them about communication. Like saying, for example, here's some of the resources that we found about how to communicate with Indigenous partners and with Indigenous communities. And we would highly recommend that you consider these when you're doing your outreach. I think that could probably make a really big difference.
Thanks. And we have one final shorter question that we can answer. Perhaps, are there plans to make the data you're collecting as a postdoc open? If so, have you or the Center for Indigenous Fisheries thought about where to archive that while maintaining Indigenous data sovereignty?
Such an excellent question. So most of the data that I'm collecting at this point for for the partnership that I am a part of with the Tzo'kitin Nation is actually already existing data from the Department of, or from British Columbia to talk about industry and things like that. So that project is actually going to be a mapping project that uses existing data. And we haven't collected any new data, but we might in the next year, at which point we'll talk about whether it should be public or not, but that will be a decision that we make alongside the Tzo'kitin Nation. But I will say in the past, for some of my PhD work, I had a publication that just recently came out in Global Change Biology in April. And that was a meta-analysis that brought together data that were collected from folks all over the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. And some of those data were owned by Indigenous folks in the Federated States of Micronesia in the Ulithi Atoll. And I did run into a bit of a challenge there because the Ulithi folks wanted to retain ownership of their data, so they didn't want to make it public. But Global Change Biology does have a public open data requirement. And so I was able to work with the editors of that paper to get them to allow us to withhold the metadata so that the data could be made public and the results could be verifiable, but that no one could actually make use of the data for a new analysis without reaching out to the folks who own it. I know that doesn't really answer your question about data repositories. There are some I know of that are specifically geared towards Indigenous data sovereignty. For example, I think NSF has an organization called Merkatu. I think it's Murkato. I may be pronouncing that wrong. I can look that up also and post it on this resource link. And that one is specifically geared to support Indigenous nations who are collecting data, who want to not necessarily make it public, but want to store it somewhere on a third-party site and then have control over whether it is public or whether it can be shared with, who it can be shared with, and so forth. So there are resources for that, but I'm not super familiar with them because of my own experiences so far. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for sharing that strategy of holding the metadata to avoid perhaps not respecting the sovereignty of that and the decision making and the autonomy of deciding what is being analyzed. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We are at the hour, and I want to wrap up and be respectful of everyone's time. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Cannon, from the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, for this conversation and this talk, and just really humbling us and sharing your experiences, learnings, and teachings. And thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much again for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
I'm glad. Yay. So to everyone online, thank you for joining us in our second talk of the NCEAS DEIJ seminar series. And please join us again on June 14th for our final talk with Dr. Grace Wu. And yeah, with that, we'd like to wrap up and have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.